The Enfield Horror, not to be confused with the haunting that was in the movie The Conjuring 2, is actually a cryptid seen by several people in 1973 in Enfield, Illinois. What happened in Enfield back during the 70s was scary enough to convince people to move away and never come back, hence the population drop of 200 people. Now only 600 residents live there today. The beast's appearance, though, is described by various witnesses, and it's pretty odd to say the least. Several people saw the creature, although many discrepancies do exist concerning what it looks like. Regardless of what it does look like, enough people had eyewitness accounts, and evidence seems to back up the story of this creature being very odd. Kind of like the platypus in real life, this creature does seem to have a mismatch of parts. According to the eyewitnesses, the monster has 3 legs, gray fur, huge pink eyes, 2 small arms attached to the front of its body, and stands approximately 4.5 feet tall. Other reports do say that the beast's body resembles that of a monkey. At least one witness had pointed out that the body had a somewhat humanoid appearance, but despite its crazy shape, it apparently can run pretty darn fast and lets out a scream very similar to a wildcat. On the evening of April 25th, 1973, Greg Garrett, only 10 years old, was out playing in his backyard of his rural home as his parents watched TV indoors. The boy's parents were startled when their son purportedly suddenly burst in through the back door, crying hysterically, and had a terrifying story to tell. Greg claimed that he'd been playing out in the yard. A hideous, misshapen beast had emerged from the darkness to attack him. According to Greg, the creature was otherworldly, around 5 feet tall, with 3 legs, short, small arms tipped with taloned hands, gray skin covered with slime, and pretty darn large red eyes. The beast actually stomped on his feet, ripping his shoes with its claws in the process, before he had run to the house in terror. The police who arrived at the scene could find no trace of the creature as the boy had described. But, more than a half an hour later, the creature would make another appearance, this time in the neighbors of the Garretts, one Henry McDaniel. It started when McDaniel's children claimed to hear something scratching outside of their house, and when he went to investigate, he heard the odd scratching noises as well. McDaniel thought at first it must have been some sort of animal, maybe a cat or a stray dog, so he went out to confront whatever animal it was. When he opened the door, he didn't see a dog or a cat. There on the front porch was a bizarre monstrosity which could prove to match exactly the description of what Greg Garrett had seen just an hour and a half before. McDaniel then described it to the authorities. He had spoke that it had 3 legs, a short body, 2 small arms coming out of its breast area, and 2 big pink eyes the size of flashlights. It stood 4.5 feet tall and was grayish colored, and it was apparently trying to get into his house. Fearing for his life, McDaniel slammed the door shut and rushed off to retrieve a pistol he kept in the house for defense. When he went back to open the door, the monster was still there, scratching away, and hissed at the man reportedly like a wildcat. He then frantically fired several shots at the monster, hitting it dead on, after which it reportedly leapt away at a frenetic rate, allegedly covering 75 feet in 3 spectacular leaps before disappearing into the darkness. The terrified man called the police, claiming to have seen a monster from outer space. When authorities searched the area, they discovered a series of footprints that measured 4 inches across and looked like those of a dog, only with 6 pads instead of the usual 4, and seeming to be something with only 3 legs based on the layout and the fact that one footprint was smaller than the rest. They also found some curious scratch marks on the outside of the house that corroborated the story of something trying to get in. Yet, despite these findings, authorities were skeptical of McDaniel's claims. Whatever the thing was, it came around McDaniel's house again in the dark early morning hours of May 6th. This time, at around 3 a.m., he was woken by his neighbor's dogs barking. When he went to go and see what the noise was about, he saw it on the railroad tracks near his home, the very same monster he'd seen before. The creature was described as casually lumbering along the railway tracks, and this time McDaniels didn't shoot at it, but rather stared in puzzlement, as it wandered around for several minutes along the tracks before running away into the night. McDaniel's encounters soon made the rounds, and before long word had gotten out about the Enfield Horror stalking the night. Visitors began coming in looking to catch a glimpse of it, bringing a good amount of publicity to the small, quaint rural town that they were not used to. It got to the point where the sheriff warned McDaniel to stop spreading his stories in order to keep the rumor under wraps. But despite these threats, people continued to come to the town in droves. Although many of these visitors were just curiosity seekers hoping to see the monster for themselves, others were more ambitious monster hunters, who came armed to the teeth and dead set on bringing whatever the creature was down. This alarmed the locals, as the last thing they wanted in their previously peaceful, quiet community was a bunch of trigger-happy thrill-seekers out in the woods with loaded guns and tons of booze. Some of these monster hunters further fueled the frenzy of monster rumors with bizarre sightings of their own. Two hunters from Indiana by the name of Mike Mogul and Roger Tappy had claimed to have seen what they described as a large gray monkey running through the underbrush, which moved too quickly for them to get a good shot at it. In another incident, 5 hunters were arrested for hunting violations and as a threat to public safety after they opened fire together on what they would later claim to be a gray hairy creature they'd seen in the woods. The hunters even claimed to have hit it, but that their bullets had no effect. The sheriff didn't believe any of it and considered them to just be a posse of gun-toting thrill-seekers out drinking and raising hell. The final major sighting of the Enfield Horror was made by a group of 4 men searching the area, one of them being Rick Rainbow, the news director of radio station WWKI in Kokomo, Indiana. The group claimed that they had seen a gray, stooped-over monkey-like creature running through the woods near an abandoned house not far from McDaniel's property. The strange thing was reported to have been moving at a speed far faster than a man could run, and had finally disappeared into the forest. The creature this time supposedly let out a very loud scream, which apparently was recorded. Famed cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman would later write an article about the Enfield Horror in the July 1974 edition of Fate magazine. The article was entitled "Swamp Slobs Invade Illinois." He interviewed locals, listened to the Rainbow recording himself, and searched through the area looking for any signs of the beast. He went eventually to the actual home of McDaniel to investigate, and it was there that he claimed to have actually heard the creature's wailing for himself. Coleman later went on to say about the incident that he had traveled to Enfield, interviewed the witnesses, and looked at the siding of the house the Enfield monster had damaged. He heard some strange, screeching, banshee-like sounds and walked away bewildered. So what exactly is the Enfield Horror? There have been many ideas and theories thrown around out there over the years to try to come to some understanding of the bizarre story, running from the rational to the more fantastic. One possible notion of what was seen was an escaped kangaroo, as this could have to do with its leaping prowess, as well as give the impression of having only 3 legs under certain conditions. The problem is that a kangaroo really looks nothing like what they described, and leaves different tracks other than what were found, and faced with this possibility, the witness himself, McDaniel, flat out dismissed it, stating that what he had seen was no kangaroo. It was also thought of that an escaped ape could have possibly been the culprit, but that doesn't truly fit the description of this strange beast. More mundane animals thought might have been would be large dogs, calves, horses, bears, deer, and wildcats. Although other theories have branched out into more fringe realms, including the idea that the Enfield Horror was a genetic experiment gone wrong, possible alien running around, or even an actual literal demon. There's also a possibility that the Enfield Horror never existed at all. Several red flags go up when you think about it, that the main sightings were made by one man, McDaniel, and the other witness, the boy, Garrett, would later retract his report and said it was been something that he had made up after the scary stories had already started. As for the hunters who saw the creature, it had been thought that these men had been influenced by the strange stories and either made up their accounts or misidentified other wildlife in a panic. In fact, the idea that the whole Enfield Horror phenomenon was the result of mass hysteria was actually studied in '78 by a team of sociologists at Western Illinois University headed by David L. Miller, who looked into the series of events as a case study of social contagion, whereby large groups of crowds of people can be influenced by group emotions like panic, hysteria, collective visions, and extreme instances of suggestibility. According to the researchers, the Enfield Horror reports had their base in just a handful of sightings, which then had proceeded to cause panic and get out of control with exaggeration in the media and wild rumors among the populace until it all reached a fever pitch. It's unlikely that we'll ever know if the creature was ever real in a sense of merely the product of delusion and social hysteria. After 1973, the monster wasn't seen again, making it very hard to just verify what's going on. Interestingly, a small spate of sightings that may or may not have had any connection to the Enfield Horror occurred in 1941 and 42 in the village of Mount Vernon, about 40 miles away from Enfield. In these reports, locals claimed to have been terrorized by a strange beast which could leap large distances and looked somewhat like a baboon, which was blamed on a string of mysterious deaths of various livestock. It's unclear just what the connection, if there is any, that the Mount Vernon monster has to the Enfield Horror, but it's been suggested that it could have been the same creature. However, there's been no further reports since then, leaving us to just scratch our heads and wonder. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment if you'd like, and join us Friday for another The Unknown Files here on Unknown Territory.